The Right Reverend John E. Hines was the youngest man ever elected to the highest office of the Episcopal Church. His tenure there, though often controversial, profoundly shaped the future of the church. Throughout his years as a young clergyman, later as Bishop of Texas, and finally as presiding bishop, John Hines was considered one of the finest preachers and public speakers in the American church.
We spoke in our last segment about your establishing St. Stephen's School in secondary school in Austin. A couple of years after that, you established a seminary for the Southwest, also in Austin. What impelled that, and to what extent was it successful?
It was an interesting and hazardous undertaking. But we wanted to do more than just provide a place for the almost surplus supply of clergy at the time. We wanted to think about the whole matter of theological education in this new complex world, and to see if we could put together a seminary which would eschew, not because there weren't values to it, eschew the traditional theological education which for most of the life of the Episcopal Church in this country had been pursued by its normal seminaries. We felt now was a time when you could take a new look at things, have some analysis of theological education and its needs, and the analysis ought to include, what society needs from the church. So we sought to have a first-class seminary, which would not be just a local seminary. We wanted to avoid that, which eventually would be a seminary of the whole church, but which would utilize the wide-open, still frontierish resources of the Southwest in terms of ideas and hopes and expectations, and also fiscal realizations, and produce a seminary which could, in reality, not mind so much whether its graduates were ordained into the ordained ministry, although that would probably be its primary thrust, but would care whether or not their theological education was centered around some kind of dialogue between the Christian faith and culture, to bring these two together as best we could by the most competent authorities that we could do it, and to see if we couldn't influence the type of person who entered the ordained ministry in this fashion.
Fascinating challenge.
And it was a challenge, but it was one that we were happy to accept, and it was much more enthusiastically supported than, for example, the coeducational boarding school was, which really was breaking some pioneering grounds, and people in the Southwest weren't even sure that boys and girls ought to go to school coeducationally in the same situation. But nevertheless, the seminary did excite the interest and imagination of people, and today is, of course, operating as one of the accredited seminaries of the Episcopal Church.
Marvelous.
Bishop Hines saw the total integration between worship and engaging the world, that it was true praxis, so to speak, a meeting place between theory and practice, between ideas, and how those ideas would be lived out in the world. And the person who designed the chapel, I think, knew of that vision, and he wanted in some respects to put that in concrete reality. And one of the first things that you notice is that the cross is not inside the chapel. The cross is outside the chapel. The cross stands outside the windows. You can see it as you approach the altar, but it is not enclosed in any particular institutional space. And it seems, as you receive the sacrament and you hear the word, it seems to draw you out.
For John Hines, as a liberal evangelical Protestant, his theology, his total underpinning was based around the cross. I was talking one time to a woman in the church here in Bastrop that had grown up in a southern town in Georgia. And we were talking about this, and she said, "Oh, wow, I know exactly what you mean. I know exactly what that's like. I grew up the same environment." She said, but I've got a name for it. I said, "What's that, Martha?" And she said, "It's the dance. It's the Southern dance. We dance around this and we dance around that. You know, we make sure we don't make anybody mad, but we just dance around the truth enough to get by." So I thought, the Southern dance. Well, that's what it is. That's what Southerners do. We do this little dance. That's what we're supposed to do as Southerners. What else would we do? So I thought, well, now I got a name for it. I got kind of an explanation. And when I went to see Bishop Hines the next time to interview him about the book, first thing I said was, "Bishop Hines, you know, we've been talking about that deal for a long time, and I got a name for it. I said, it's the dance. It's the Southern dance." And he looked at me without a moment's hesitation. And he said, "Ken, you can dance around a cross if you want to, but you can't dance around a cross with a man on it."
History. And even after reading his autobiography, Granted on Fire, I'm not sure where the story or event took place, but he told me in one evening he was at home, and a group of individuals came to his house because there was going to be a lynching in town, and that he had left the home immediately to go put an end to this, to try and stop this just evil and horrible event. And of course, as I sat there thinking about myself in such a situation, wondering about what life in ministry actually was like, the complexities of being a rector or a priest in the church, I kind of blurted out that true moment, that true thought, if you will, which was, "How did you know what you were doing?" You know, and he said, "I just knew it was right." And I have to say that those words have stayed with me throughout my whole ministry. He just knew that it was right. I don't think that I knew at that time, and even up until recently, that I would ever carry the same crozier as the bishop, or that I would be the bishop of the Diocese of Texas, or sit in the same chair. I'm not sure that I could have imagined the difficulties between the theology and the faithful proclamation of justice that John Hines offered, and the struggle that we would endure as a church, certainly even in the few early months of my own tenure. But in each one of those conversations, I do remember carefully those words: to do what's right, to do what's right.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Because up to that point, they tended to dismiss calls as the action of fringe persons. I mean, loonies, really. And when you have someone of the presiding bishop's stature, that really shook the establishment, as it were.
What the church can do and must do in order to exhibit as best it can the kind of love reflected in that declaration, "God so loved the world," is to see that justice is enacted in society for all men and women, whoever they are. Now, when the church adopts this as its mission, then it begins to understand how it's related to the Lord Jesus Christ and his death and resurrection. It can relate itself in a certain sense theologically, metaphysically in a way, doctrinally in a way, but it can only get at the deep resources and power and meaning of the Christian faith by its own crucifixion in service